I'm Al Hunt.
And I'm Mark Halperin. With all due respect to the way this entire campaign has been covered so far.
But let me give an answer for the American people. Who cares? Who cares what Donald is tweeting late at night?
Hello from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a.k.a. Brew City in the Badger State. Hillary Clinton's campaign is playing down her chances in the primary here. To be held a week from tomorrow. But don't tell that to candidate Hillary Clinton herself, who's speaking to Wisconsinites tonight in Madison, later in Milwaukee, and spending a couple of days here, at least this week. Al Hunt joins me in Washington tonight. Al, maybe Brooklyn is bluffing, playing down their chances. Either way, why is the candidate working so hard in a state that she may well lose?
Mark, she really has to. The burn has a bit of momentum now, and she certainly wants to slow that. The night of the March 15 Super Tuesday primaries, when Sanders got clobbered, Tad Devine, his chief strategist, laid out with great clarity their plan. Win a bunch of caucuses, they've done that. Go head-to-head, beat her in Wisconsin, and then have a showdown in New York. It's Robert E. Lee, June 1863. You got to beat the enemy on their own turf. She wants to avoid that. New York is Gettysburg, and she doesn't want a showdown. She wants to get back to her inevitability in the general election.
Yeah, my spidey sense says that they may be downplaying her chances here so that if she does win, even by a little bit, it will look like a big victory. I also think candidate Clinton, like her husband, they don't like to give up on any state, particularly a state that's got general election importance. And finally, I think obviously margins matter. Sanders' huge wins over the weekend, his win in New Hampshire. They don't want there to be another state where Sanders not only gets a W, but a big W.
Yeah, I agree. I think they are more confident, actually, than they were even a week ago. Not confident. I think it's very, from what I hear, it's very close out there. No real reliable polls. But she has to contest. She can't get beaten by 10 or 12 points in Wisconsin by Bernie Sanders.
Yeah. You know, if you take the Clinton folks and the Sanders folks at their word, despite the limited public polling showing Clinton a little bit ahead in the race close, they say that this is going to be a Sanders state. He's well organized here. The demographics lay up well for him. And, you know, if you look at the history of who's done well in this primary, like Jesse Jackson, it should be a Sanders state, but she is here fighting for it.
Okay, Mark, let's move on. Today, the Clinton campaign was dealt a double whammy on that old email story. Our former colleague, Del Quinton Wilbur, reports in the Los Angeles Times that federal prosecutors are setting up interviews with members of Clinton's staff, as well as possibly Clinton herself. And the Washington Post adds that in 2009, when State Department officials looked into Clinton's wish to use her BlackBerry in secure areas, they were apparently not told that Clinton's phone was tied to her private email server in Chappaqua. Mark, what's the worst-case scenario for Secretary Clinton on the email front?
There's no indication there's a grand jury yet. The Clinton folks have very cleverly been welcoming her to be interviewed by the FBI for months to try to take out the gee whiz factor when and if that happens. But I do think her aides going before the FBI is potentially problematic. You'll see reports of the interviews, maybe leaks from FBI agents who don't like the Clintons about what they said. And there's the possibility that there are new facts that come into play if it happens simultaneous to Sanders winning Wisconsin and then, from her point of view, worst case, winning New York. If it all happens within the context of those two contests and he wins them both, I think it causes the Democratic Party to stand up a little bit and say, wait a minute, where is this going? What are we getting ourselves into?
Yeah, there's a lot of nervousness already, Mark. I think, first of all, James Comey, the FBI director, is a straight shooter. So I think people are going to have confidence in whatever he does. Nobody really knows. And talking to the few detached experts who say that she displayed a reckless arrogance here, they say you have to prove intent. And they think that's close to impossible with her. Not necessarily with her age, though. So I don't think the story is going to be settled for at least a couple months.
Yeah, I mean, if it keeps going on, I think the short term is her bigger problem, because if she can dispatch with Bernie Sanders, I think Democrats will just do whatever they need to get through the general election. And while the Attorney General and the FBI Director are both considered pretty straight shooters, this is still a complex situation where you've got a Democratic administration investigating the Democratic frontrunner. And I think Sanders, while he's played down this issue, let's see what happens in the coming weeks. There's no doubt, though, that the Clinton folks have spun this and that the facts already known are worse than they like to acknowledge, at least in terms of being cavalier about what she did in terms of both secrecy and in terms of government accountability. and potential espionage. All right, April should be a dizzy month in New York, and not just because American Psycho is finally opening on Broadway. The Empire State primary is April 19, and ahead of that, Bernie Sanders has been challenging Hillary Clinton to do the next debate in her adopted home state. Team Clinton was asked about that challenge several times today in TV interviews, and here is what seems to be Brooklyn's official response.
Speaking of New York, I thought there was a really interesting article this weekend in the Washington Post where the Sanders campaign laid out what their strategy is going to be in this primary, and they made it clear that they intend to attack Hillary. They intend to run a very negative campaign here, and it's our hope that they don't do that. You know, they were poll testing attack lines against her this weekend.
What was notable this weekend wasn't so much that, but in my mind was the Washington Post story with his own campaign talking about how they're poll testing more negative attacks on Hillary Clinton. They're talking about running harsher negatives now. We saw them run negative ads.
Don't distract here, Joel.
I think the real question is not whether we're going to debate.
Why wouldn't you debate?
Because I think the real question is what kind of campaign is Senator Sanders going to run going forward? He pumped $4 million in the weekend before March 15th. And he lost all 5 states on March 15th. They spent about $4 million running negative ads.
That doesn't have anything to do with the debate,
Let's see.
Why not
Let's see
debate?
the tone. This is a man who said he'd never run a negative ad, ever. He's now running them. They're now planning to run more. Let's see the tone of the campaign he wants to run.
So not a lot of direct response there to the debate challenge. On a call with reporters today, Sanders' campaign manager, Jeff Weaver, applied a little more pressure on Team Clinton.
We hope that the Clinton campaign will relent, that they will let the people in the state that twice elected the secretary to the U.S. Senate have the opportunity to see a one-on-one debate between Senator Sanders and the secretary. You know, it's difficult for us to understand the motivation of why they would not want that to happen, why they would want to prevent the people of New York from having that opportunity.
So after that Sanders campaign call, the Clinton campaign hosted a call of its own, saying Sanders will campaign in the Empire State primary, quote, like a Brooklynite, while Clinton will campaign like the former senator that she was. So, Al, the Sanders campaign clearly wants a debate in New York State. It's pretty clear to me why they want that. Will they be able to force Secretary Clinton to agree to do their next debate before the primary in the Empire State somewhere?
Yeah, I think they will, Mark. Every day she refuses to debate is another good day for him to hammer her on it. The DNC tried to rig these debates. They ought to have a debate. But I really feel sorry for poor Joel Benenson's virgin ears. He ought to look at the other party if he thinks if this is too negative. One guy is a sleaze, the other guy is a liar, and they're arguing over whose wife wears combat boots. He hadn't seen anything yet.
Every Clinton surrogate who was on television today came more in sadness than in anger in talking about the negativity of the Sanders campaign. They're trying to change the subject. It's fascinating to me that they think they're going to be able to maybe not only not debate in New York, but it seems like they're trying to kill the debates, even though they agreed to them in exchange for getting a New Hampshire debate. The main reason I think the Sanders campaign will probably win this and force Brooklyn's hand is when you ever have a debate about debates, the side the press is for generally wins. And the press would love a Gotham City showdown between these two candidates. Love.
Yeah, no, I agree. And what's the case against a debate? I mean, the idea that the campaign's gotten too negative is utter nonsense. And I think Republicans have had probably twice as many, 3 times as many debates. They ought to have a debate, and Bernie will win this. She will relent. Ought to do it sooner rather than later.
Yeah, or maybe let Bill O'Reilly be the moderator. Yeah. All right, coming up, Trump, Cruz, and the Twitter after this. Not living under a rock or in North Korea? Then you probably know that Donald Trump likes doing phone interviews, or as we call them in the news dodge, phoners. So it was no surprise that Trump phoned in to a radio program here in Wisconsin with host Charlie Sykes today. What was a surprise to some was the treatment he got from Sykes over the personal feud that Trump's been having with Ted Cruz. Here's a sample of that very interesting conversation.
Obviously, I failed in my effort to introduce you to Wisconsin and our tradition of civility and decency by getting an apology from you for Heidi Cruz or for what you said about Scott Walker.
Well, am I getting an apology by somebody that sent out a picture of my wife to every in the state of Utah?
And as we know, that was an independent group, and you don't want me to hold you accountable for what your supporters are doing.
Apologize? Is Ted Cruz going to apologize for starting it and sending out that picture?
And that's your stand.
I thought it was very inappropriate. I do apologize. I believe in apologizing, but I think I think before I would think about apologizing, he owes me an apology because what he did was wrong. Again, I didn't start it. He started it. If he didn't start it, it would have never happened.
Right.
Nothing like this would have ever happened. But he started it. So, but I would
remember, we're not on.
You just said it's fine with
me. We're not on a playground. We're running for president of the United States.
I agree with that 100%. Right. And my views are not playground views.
100% not on the playground. The other place that Trump likes to make news is Twitter. And it turns out that Ted Cruz doesn't care much for all that. A sentiment that he let the American people know today.
But let me give an answer for the American people. Who cares? Who cares what Donald is tweeting late at night? We need real solutions for the real problems in this country. That's the focus of my campaign.
Al, the family feud between Trump and Cruz goes on. Some people, I've said, it's bad for Cruz. Charlie Sykes, the very powerful Milwaukee radio host, says that Trump's failure to apologize is going to hurt him with Wisconsin voters. Who is losing right now in Trump v. Cruz?
I think they're both losing, Mark. This is so unattractive. All the guardrails have come down. It used to be that spouses and families were off limits. I remember candidates in the past whose wives had real serious problems, and those were never raised. But this time it doesn't matter. And I agree with Charlie Sykes, who I've never met, that for Donald Trump to go on and say he started it, it reminds me of when my kids were 7 and 5 and they got into a fight and they would yell, he started it, she started it. It is just, I think it is so unbecoming and harmful.
And there's just no doubt that that's not a standard that a president could possibly adhere to say that if someone does something that they could go and do whatever they wanted in response as long as they didn't start it. The other thing is I continue. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Mark. You go ahead, Mark.
I continue to believe that Cruz is just getting way off message. He's not going to beat Donald Trump at this game, and he just gets way off message if this is the only thing he makes it onto the news, even though he's out there talking about other stuff. As long as he talks about this will dominate the headlines. Yeah,
I agree, and but the key will be who wins Wisconsin, because then it'll be on the back burner after that, and I think Cruz has a shot to win Wisconsin.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Today, John Kasich campaigned in West Salem, Wisconsin. There is a third candidate. He's billed himself as the adult in the room, and he said that he has a lot of things to do in his life that are more important than watching Donald Trump's interviews. Mark, what cards does Kasich really have to play other than electability?
Well, he talks all the time about how he is leading Hillary Clinton in head-to-head polls, and the other two Republicans aren't, and there's certainly a case to make for that. But I think he's going to have to break through with his record in Ohio. The fact that he's a governor who's got a high approval rating and has gotten things done in his state, even though he's done some things conservatives don't like, it seems to me he's got to talk about more than electability, and he's got that card to play, and he does talk about it, but he's not doing it in a way that's breaking through very much. Forget to voters or even in the media. I'm not hearing from elites in the Republican Party very much, from donors or members of Congress or anybody, saying, my goodness, this is an accomplished man. He's the right person to be president. It can't just be about electability. It's got to be about governing.
Yeah, the electability issue is real, but I agree it doesn't much resonate. And he has to hope for a break. Somehow he and Cruz have to conspire, collude. It's perfectly legit. And I would think if I look ahead where he might do well in Pennsylvania, and then what he would love to do is go head-to-head with Trump in New Jersey, in Chris Christie's state, and compare his record to Chris Christie's record to run against both Trump and Christie. If he could do that and Cruz gets out of the way and spends time in California, that might start to, have some of those people take notice.
Before we get there, he's got to hold its own. He's got to hold his own in Wisconsin and New York. Yeah. He's got to show that he can be in there competing for delegates. There's no reason why he shouldn't do well based on his resume, not just electability, in both Wisconsin and New York. And if he can do that, if he can effectively turn them into three-way races, even if he's third, if he's a strong third, I think that does give him the argument to make to say he's going to the convention.
Yep.
All right. On the flight from New York to Milwaukee today, I was thinking that even though the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, has riled up more partisan bickering than any other issue over the last 6 years or so, it has barely come up in this presidential election. Maybe I was doing all that thinking because I read Al Hunt's Bloomberg View column today on that very point. Al, why isn't Obamacare getting more attention from the candidates on both sides of the aisle in this campaign?
Mark, what an exciting plane trip that must have been. I think you're right. It does still rile up the base, and they go through the motions. But and Bernie does too with his left-wing base. The problem Republicans have is if they really make a big deal of it, someone's going to say, "Okay, what's your alternative?" And the minute they get to alternative, whatever the values, or whatever value it might have, it would mean millions of people will go off the coverage rolls, and that's a real problem for them. So that's why it's just easier to attack and not. It's easier to talk about repeal rather than replace.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's not one candidate left in this race who talks about a new federal program on a regular basis in a way that real people understand. Ted Cruz has a tax plan. I haven't found a voter yet, elite or grassroots, who knows about it and is excited about the plan. Trump has no specific plans that he talks about very much. Even Kasich doesn't talk about specific plans. He talks about his record and his biography. So talking about their health care plan when it is such a complicated issue just isn't in the cards. And as you suggested, you attack the Affordable Care Act, you got to have something to say about what you'd replace it with, particularly since parts of the program remain popular.
Yeah, that's true.
Yep. All right, taking a break now. When we come back, Kellyanne Conway is here again to talk on behalf of the candidate she's supporting from a bit of a distance, Ted Cruz, right after this. And we are back, and joining us now from our New York studio is the president of the Ted Cruz Super PAC, Keep the Promise, also the strategist for the full constellation of Cruz Super PACs, strategist, pollster Kellyanne Conway. President Conway, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Hi.
How would you appraise Ted Cruz's current chances to become the Republican nominee?
Well, they're great. We started out with 17 Republican candidates. We're down to 3. I would say maybe 2.5. If you really look at the current delegate count. Obviously, there are 2 paths for Senator Cruz. The first is he can win outright with 1,237 delegates. There's about an 80–85% chance of him doing that. Plan B+, as we call it at the PAC, is to go into an open contested convention, having aggregated a fair number, very respectably high number of delegates across a swath of different states, Mark. Head into that convention as the odds-on favorite, given the fact that Mr. Trump has a whole bunch of people who would like to stop him from being the Republican nominee.
How do your super PACs plan to spend its resources over the next month to try to help Ted Cruz become the nominee? TV ads, other things? All
of that. And in Wisconsin, of course, we think you could really reset the race in Wisconsin. It's a very important state, upper Midwest. It's a great test for whether or how hard people can swallow some of the venom that's been foisted upon them recently, particularly by one messenger. And I also think in Wisconsin, it's a wonderful test of retail politicking. Because we've had these contests coming so fast and furiously of late, we really have missed, those of us in politics have missed the vigor of the retail politicking that we saw all across Iowa, South Carolina, New Hampshire. Wisconsin seems to be a very good similar test for that. So at our super PAC, we've put down about $800,000 all told for Wisconsin, TV, radio, digital, phone program, get out the vote program. And so we're all in for Wisconsin. You see Senator Cruz is spending an awful lot of time there. But we also are trying to husband our resources for the contests that are coming up, slicing and dicing some of these states by congressional district. And third, Mark, we have just started with a great deal of rigor, frankly, looking at the convention. We have some convention experts, legal and also delegate experts at our disposal. Many on a volunteer basis now trying to come to us and give us that Plan B+ for July, which seems like a very short time from now.
Kellyanne, it's Al Hunt here. I hate to I hate to bring this up, but is this personal exchange, this bitter personal exchange, bad for your candidate in that it distracts from the issues that he wanted to run against Donald Trump on? And is that really a distraction for Ted Cruz?
It's a distraction for the voters, Al. I agree with you. And it would be a distraction for Senator Cruz if he continues to be in the cesspool. I think he dabbled in there to defend his wife and has gotten out. He should stay out of it, in my view. Same thing I would have told Senator Rubio. If you play on somebody else's turf and you don't allow the voters to hear substantive debates about the issues on which they care, you're already losing. So that's why I'm very happy that Senator Cruz is out there talking about issues today. But I can't fault him for, one, defending his own honor, that he had nothing to do with the placement of a picture from an outside group. Let me make very clear, as somebody who runs the largest pro-Cruz super PAC and has from day one, that picture had nothing, an ad had nothing to do with us. It's an anti-Trump PAC. And those who are saying, oh, Cruz knew about it, he knew about it, you're alleging that A, he lied, but B, that he violated federal law. Those are very serious allegations. So A, Cruz had to defend his own honor, condemned it the moment he saw it, and B, had to defend his wife. And I think he did so quite forceful. I don't think that, please, go ahead.
No, I'm going to say, if you get on the issues, what issues do you think are good for you? Or, I mean, what one or two issues do you think you can really score points against Donald Trump on that a lot of them haven't worked so far?
Well, a few things. And the fact that Cruz is still in this race out, not having had the $2 billion in free media time Mr. Trump has had, according to the Washington Post analysis recently, the fact that he's not a self-funder, and the fact that he's still there. Ted Cruz has been told from the beginning, you're not electable, you're too far right, why are you doing this, wait your turn. It's quite remarkable given the fact that so many other people were supposed to win, quote unquote, were electable. And I think part of it is people do know him from his fight against Obamacare. You have all these Republican senators in Washington who want to repeal and replace Obamacare, but only one man, Ted Cruz, stood on his feet for 21 hours in the well of the United States Senate. So I agree actually in part with your column today, Al, that I personally would like to hear more about the plan to replace Obamacare. Ted's out there talking about his flat tax plan. He's out there talking about destroying ISIS. He's out there talking about not being neutral on Israel, but in fact standing with one of our best friends in the region. So those voters who want to hear about substance and policy, and I frankly believe there are many, there's plenty to choose from if they listen to Senator Cruz.
Kellyanne, Conway, I say with admiration, you're as good a filibuster as the candidate you're supporting, Ted Cruz.
Green eggs and ham, thank you.
Quickly, less than 20 seconds. Tell me the single biggest mistake Donald Trump has made in the last 2 weeks. Just in like a phrase.
Sure. No ground game, no polling, the ability to have your own data and your own vaunted ground game where it counts, because the late-breaking voters don't go to him, they go to Cruz.
All right. Pollster says the mistake is no polling. Kellyanne, Conway, thank you very much. When we come back, Harold Ford Jr. and Michael Feldman joined us to talk about all things Sanders and Clinton. We'll be right back after this.
Welcome back. Hillary Clinton is speaking about Supreme Court nominee Merrick Garland at the University of Wisconsin. Clinton is challenging Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley to hold a hearing on President Obama's nominee to the Supreme Court. Also today, Merrick Garland, the nominee, met with Democratic Senators Joe Donnelly and Ben Cardin on Capitol Hill. Joining us now from New York to discuss this and more is Democratic strategist Harold Ford, a former congressman from Tennessee, and former Chief of Staff to Vice President Al Gore, Democratic strategist Michael Feldman. Welcome, gentlemen. Mike, let me start with you. Isn't this inside baseball, or do you think the voters will really care about whether there's a hearing or not on a high court nominee?
Oh, I think they'll care. I mean, they'll care about who's going to fill out that Supreme Court. So this is good primary politics for Secretary Clinton, in that it energizes the base and it gets people focused on what's at stake in this election. And it's also good general election politics for her, because in the end there's going to be a choice, and whoever gets elected is going to ultimately be responsible for the makeup of the court. Not just this nominee, but potentially 2 or 3 others during the course of his or her presidency. So this is good politics all the way around for her.
Harold, aren't the Republicans going to come back and say, when the shoe was on the other foot, Hillary Clinton filibustered Sam Alito? She didn't want to vote on that, And so it's just a matter of who's doing the nominating, who's in the opposition.
I expect them to do it. They've already started some of that by citing this, I think, fictitious Biden rule. I think the vice president's come out to clarify it. I think in her speech today, as I imagine some of it's going on now, she lays out concerns on the progressive side of the ledger, from guns to women's rights to voting rights. I mean, issues, to Michael's point, that not only will help during this primary season, but will help unite the party after the primary between her and Senator Sanders. I think the second part of this that is so critical, and to your point, I think it creates a real problem for some of these battleground Republican Senate states, from Ohio to Pennsylvania, where we've already seen Illinois, Senator Kirk and others come forward to say perhaps we should have a hearing. I think if Judge Garland gets a hearing, I think it's very likely that the country will say this is the kind of model, the kind of person we'd like to see serving on the court, not hyper-partisan, or for that matter, even partisan choices. Judge Garland fits right in that mode. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out over the next, or I should say in the coming months.
Just play hypothetical with me, not impossible. If he wins Wisconsin and then upsets her in New York, does the race get transformed at all? And if so, how?
Well, you talk, which one you,
we couldn't hear you,
to either?
Michael first.
Okay.
Look, you can paint a scenario where that becomes the case. I think the trickier thing for her is how she fends off, attacks from Senator Sanders, and how she continues to make a primary election argument while keeping one eye on the general election and knowing that she's going to need all those strands that make up the Democratic nominating process. She's going to need them energized in the fall. Now, it may be if she faces a guy like Donald Trump that some of that happens for her, but she can't depend on that. So she needs to be very careful how she continues to march towards the nomination. I don't think, I think she's in a good place, but I think it's more on how she does it, not if she does it.
Mark, if that happens...
Harold, the Clinton.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Harold.
No, I think if indeed that happens, it clearly puts pressure on what has to happen here in New York. We'll have to wait and see. I do think when she gives speeches like she gave today, when she lays out a foreign policy plan, when she lays out a specific economic plan, these are the things that differentiate her from Senator Sanders. And frankly, I'm not afraid of a debate if we have to have one here in New York. I mean, I'm confident in my candidate. But to your question, if indeed that happens, which I don't think will happen, but if it does happen, it certainly makes New York that much more important.
Her campaign argued today, Congressman Ford, that Hillary Clinton had not been forced to the left in any way by Senator Sanders. Is that a credible position?
I think in large part it is. I think she's always argued and advocated for fairness for every strata of the American workforce, be it CEOs or those who work to ensure that the doors open and the floors are clean at companies across this country. I think she's always fought for women's rights and the rights of every American, regardless of their sexual orientation. And she certainly has been one who has trumpeted for a very long time a kind of tax fairness, and for that matter, a student fairness. So, you know, whenever you get in a primary...
So she's as far left as Bernie Sanders or not?
Look, Bernie Sanders is a socialist. Hillary Clinton is not a socialist. When it comes to standing up for the rights of progressives, standing up for the rights of every American to have a fair shot at success, be it a child or be it an adult or be it a worker, be it a man or be it a woman, I think she's always been there. Perhaps she's expressing it a little more aggressive than she has in the past. But for anyone to suggest she's moved to the left, I think is just not true.
Mike Feldman, let me ask you, for this campaign has been fully aired now for months. Yet there still is a huge enthusiasm gap for Hillary Clinton. Her negatives are very high, not as high as Donald Trump's, but very high. You know, how does she turn any of that around now? She hasn't succeeded so far.
Well, first of all, this is what I was talking about earlier. She has a lot of work to do to energize the Democratic base. That's part of what happens after this conversation in the primary ends, before when some of these arguments that are happening internally turn to an external conversation, turn to a general election. And look, if the nominee is Donald Trump, I think a lot of that work will be done for her, and then I think people will see the choice very clearly. But no matter who she faces, if the Republicans go in another direction or if there's an open convention, there will be a choice in November. That in and of itself will do some work in terms of galvanizing the Democratic base in the fall.
But what you're really saying is that she's reliant on the GOP disarray and problems to take care of the lack of enthusiasm for her.
No, I'm not saying that. I think that would help her, But look, Al, you know this. Inevitably, this is the rhythm of the political process. We're at a primary election right now. There's a conversation. I think ultimately a very good conversation for the Democratic Party going on right now. I think this primary challenge, whether it's moved her a little to the left or there's been a conversation about who stands for the values of the Democratic Party better. I think all that's ultimately good. But then we'll move into the fall. There will be a choice. Big issues at stake, and not just the presidency, as we mentioned before, potentially the Supreme Court in the balance. So I think all that comes together to produce a pretty energized general election.
Al, I'd say this also. I'd much rather win with an unenthusiastic majority than lose with an enthusiastic minority. So I hear you, but I think Mrs. Clinton is in a good spot.
Gentleman from Tennessee, the gentleman from the Jersey Shore, thank you both. Appreciate it.
Part-time.
When we come back, how Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton prepared to respond to the news of the Brussels attacks last week. And don't forget, if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can now listen to us in the nation's capital as well on the radio and Bloomberg 99.1. We'll be right back. The news, of course, that got most of the attention last week was the Brussels attacks and the question of national security. John Hammond and I explored how the two presidential frontrunners dealt with the immediate aftermath of the bombings for last night's episode of The Circus, which airs Sundays, 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Showtime, produced in conjunction with Bloomberg Politics. Here's a portion of what the two frontrunner campaigns told us.
When did you learn about what happened in Brussels? How did, just what happened? What was that?
I received a call in the morning, and then I turned on the television.
Like 5 a.m.?
Pretty early.
Your friend knows to call you that early. That's a good friend.
They know I'm not a big sleeper.
Yeah.
And I saw what happened, and turned on the television, saw what happened, said, here we go. Here we go.
You already were scheduled to do a bunch of morning show interviews by phone. Did you consult anybody about what to say? Did you talk to them? No.
So I don't have to consult. Look, I say it from my heart and my brain. Right. It's not just heart. It's heart and brain. And that's what I do.
So this morning, in the midst of a huge national security story, you're on network shows, you get a call from your friend, you watch a little TV, and then you just say what you want to say.
I say what I think is appropriate.
2 days ago when Brussels happened, what was this meeting like?
Yeah.
We did a call with Hillary very early in the morning. It was me and Jake and Podesta. And, you know, Jake Sullivan, obviously foreign policy expert. He worked to find out as much as we could through public sources and did morning shows from there.
So, Al, obviously Secretary Clinton prepared in a more traditional way. What do you think Republican voters and potentially general election voters will think of Trump's style in dealing with such a situation?
Mark, they ought to be worried. This is about a race for the presidency. And what a president does when confronted with an issue like this, a crisis, is that he or she tries to gather all the experts, all the information they can before they react. They don't just go on instinct, on gut. There's a lot of things to find out. Is this an isolated incident? Is there a threat elsewhere? And I think there should be great concern for Trump's, what I think is really cavalier approach to something like this.
Yeah, I mean, as you saw from our discussion with him there, he was not ambiguous. He did not try to, paper it over. He said, this is the way I do it. He's been talking a lot about foreign policy. He did the New York Times interview over the weekend on Friday that ran over the weekend, and then, of course, our interview with him last week in the Washington Post Ed Board. I'm wondering, Al, what strikes you beyond the issue we just talked about some of the positions he's taken and avoided taking over the last week on national security and foreign policy?
Well, I think some of them are probably popular. This idea of America First is probably popular with a number of voters, but I think he's creating a lot more problems for himself. First of all, America First, you'll recall, was the battle cry for the people who didn't want us to enter the war against the Nazis in World War II. But he said in that Washington Post editorial board that his model for Secretary of State, the one he likes the most, is George Shultz. George Shultz, I'm sure, is horrified by what Donald Trump said about what really is a unilateral, American foreign policy, and the heck with allies, we don't have to worry about them, we're going to go on our own. So I think short term it's appealing. Long term, I think he's created real problems for himself.
Yeah, and where do you think, Al, in a general election, which of the positions he's taken in the last week do you think, forget the stylistic stuff, any of the positions he's taken, do you think would leave him vulnerable in a general election?
Well, again, I think it's in its simplest forms, it's appealing. But really, the effect would China would dominate Asia, and you can make a case that it would enhance the power for Iran in the Middle East. That's a case that's very credible, and I think there's a number of people who are going to make it. I would expect, unless he backtracks some, that the George Shultzes, the Colin Powells, already Michael Hayden, the Republican CIA director, Steve Hadley, are all going to come out against him, and I think that cumulatively probably hurts him because they're saying, is this guy ready to be president?
Yeah, I mean, I think if there is a general election between Trump and Clinton, I think you're going to see a bunch of elites from the right endorse Clinton. Some will sit it out, some will write him in, some will look for a third candidate. But I think some will endorse Clinton. And I think the area where they're most likely to come in a way that gets a lot of symbolic attention is in the national security realm. Diplomats, former military, former cabinet members who say they're more comfortable with Hillary Clinton as commander-in-chief than Donald Trump. That'll get a lot of attention and I think influence at least some voters.
Yeah, Mark, I think you're right. You know, I go back to 1980, and a couple weeks before that election, Jimmy Carter was actually even, if not a little bit ahead of Ronald Reagan, because people were asking, can we see Reagan as commander-in-chief? In the last couple weeks, and especially the last debate, I think he proved he was up to that task. It's a much more daunting challenge for Donald Trump if he's the nominee this time.
The one thing I'll say, and I don't want to overstate this and set my Twitter feed on fire, but on some of the positions Trump has taken in terms of NATO and coming up with a new mission for it, in terms of saying America should get more in return for what it pays, in terms of rethinking America's positions in some bases around the world, I think Trump not only will strike a populist chord, but I think there's something there, and I don't think it overstates it to say Trump's not making this stuff up. He's got an instinct for not just what the public wants, but what America needs in terms of rethinking our foreign policy around the world. And I don't know that he's getting enough credit for having some positions that, dare I say it, are thoughtful.
I would dissent.
I figured you would. All right. When we come back, we're going to go deep inside the twin battles here in Wisconsin, the two primaries a week from tomorrow, right after this. Back to Milwaukee. Even though we're here in Wisconsin, we promise not to badger our next guest. All right, maybe a little. Joining us now, Charles Franklin, professor of law and public policy and the director of the Marquette Law School poll here in Wisconsin. Professor, thanks for being here.
Good to be here.
What's the difference between the culture of Milwaukee and the culture of Madison?
Oh, it's the old line manufacturing and the new biotech, and it's also kids, the University of Wisconsin.
Right.
And the Milwaukee area that's got all the heavy industry and also the concentration of minority populations in the state.
All right, two big primaries here. It's been a while since the state has had two big contested presidential primaries. Let's talk about the Republicans first. Am I right that all three of the remaining candidates could, at least in their mind, imagine winning this primary?
I'm sure they can all imagine in their mind that they could, but we've seen such a shrinkage in the field that there's a lot on the table. 31% plus of candidates that have just recently dropped out is waiting to be picked up by the other candidates. Trump has been polling in our data at 25 and then at 30 in February. That means that there's a lot of room for everyone to move up. And the question is, how much do they move up?
Right. We've not seen Trump in your polls or anywhere else jump into the mid-30s, high 30s, low 40s. Right?
Not here.
Yeah, and I'm no math genius, but if there are three candidates and Trump's at 30, that means it's, either of the other two guys, in theory, could get high enough to win.
I think that's exactly right. Ted Cruz was at 19% in our February poll. If he were the beneficiary of a lot of that on the table plus late deciders, then he could easily move up ahead of Trump if Trump doesn't see a big surge. John Kasich is further back. It would take more of an impetus for him to catch up. But it's possible that he could do it.
Charlie Sykes did an extraordinary interview with Trump today, probably the biggest, most sort of talked about thing in politics today, their long interview that they did, during which Trump said he didn't know that Sykes was part of the Stop Trump movement. How influential is he in his advocacy against Trump? Is that a big deal?
It is a big deal, and not just for him, but also for other talk radio hosts in in Milwaukee.
All pretty much uniformly pro-Cruz, anti-Trump.
Exactly, and have been for a long time. The move to Cruz is a little more recent, but the criticism of Trump has been going on all year, and it really does reflect that establishment Republican notion here that was very uncomfortable with Trump and frankly has taken a while to warm up to Cruz as the alternative. But in that interview, you certainly saw some of the criticism that Sykes and others have leveled against Trump throughout the year.
Yeah, let's switch over to the Democrats in sort of Wisconsin Democratic Party 101. This should be a relatively good state for Bernie Sanders, right?
It certainly should be. Barack Obama won it solidly in 2008 over Clinton in the primary. It is a largely white state, and Sanders has tended to do better there with those voters. But the tricky part will be that the party is quite divided, or the state is quite divided, between Madison, which is a strong source of support for Sanders with a lot of young voters and highly educated voters, whereas Clinton is doing much better in the Milwaukee area. And we have some things going on in Milwaukee that could boost turnout.
Some other races on the ballot.
We have a hot mayor's race and a hot county executive's race.
Why would those races help Clinton?
Those are local races that would boost turnout in the area that she's the strongest. People who consider themselves solid core Democrats and African Americans and Hispanics in the area, whereas Sanders does better with young people and does better with independents who only lean to the party. So you get two different directions from these two.
And if you look at his victory in Michigan and his loss in Ohio, loss in Illinois, what the economic conditions here, the demography, which is this state more like at this point?
Well, it's really kind of hard to tell. We've had some contraction in manufacturing recently, though nothing like what Michigan went through in the Great Recession. From a demographic point of view, we have a smaller minority population even within the Democratic electorate. Right. And young people do play a role. You saw that in Obama's success in the past. Finally, we're not talking about the North and West and Green Bay areas. If they came in heavily for one candidate, that could tip things even with this even battle in the South. But those areas are not uniquely strong for one candidate or another.
Right. I want to go back to the Republicans. Donald Trump's big kickoff event tomorrow is in Paul Ryan's hometown. Is that probably purposeful and symbolic, or is that a kind of place most Republicans would go for a rally?
Oh, I think it's definitely a well-chosen place. It's a place where the large GM manufacturing plant shut down a few years ago. It's a place that struggled to recover from the recession, though it has done pretty well recently. And it's in Paul Ryan's backyard, and there might be some small signal there as well.
Yeah. You were a close watcher of Paul Ryan. He has said things clearly mentioning Trump, but not calling him out the way some have, including obviously Mitt Romney. What do you think Ryan thinks of Trump right now?
Well, I think he, like most establishment Republicans, would rather he weren't the nominee, but he's been critical to an extent, but has not gone to the never Trump side of things. So he's playing a very, I think, experienced game on this, criticizing what needs to be criticized and keeps Ryan in his leadership role, but not going to the point of saying, I can't work with this guy.
They count votes fast or slow in Wisconsin?
Pretty fast, actually.
Yeah, that's been my experience. I'm looking forward to watching next Tuesday night. Thanks. We'll visit with you more as the week goes on. Professor Franklin, thank you very much. When we come back, who won the day? Right after this. Al, from Milwaukee, I ask you, who won the day?
In Milwaukee, Charlie Sykes, the radio talk show host.
He had a pretty good day. I'll say John Kasich won the day. I thought Cruz and Trump would sue for peace and not let the week be dominated by the spat, but they both played along, and I think there's a benefit to Kasich. If he's got a chance here, it's to sneak up the middle with those two guys feuding.
Yeah. I agree. If he could even finish a good second in Wisconsin, that's a big thing for him.
Yep. All right. Coming up on Bloomberg West, our colleague Emily Chang talks to next EV's U.S. CEO. Don't forget, if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can listen to us on the radio on Bloomberg 99.1. Thanks to Al in D.C. John and I will be back tomorrow in Gotham City. We'll see you then. More with all due respect. Thanks for watching and Sayonara.